Part 1. The body you've noticed. There's a moment that arrives without warning. You're in the gym, or maybe just climbing stairs, and you notice something different. The recovery that used to take a day now takes 3. The muscle soreness that was once a badge of a good workout has transformed into something that lingers, that whispers a question you can't quite ignore. Is my body changing? If you're over 40, you've probably felt it. That subtle shift where the training that built strength and muscle for 2 decades suddenly doesn't deliver the same results. You're doing everything right. The same volume, the same intensity, the same commitment. Yet something feels different. Your muscles aren't responding like they used to. Your energy dips faster. Recovery feels like climbing uphill. This isn't weakness. This isn't failure. This is biology speaking a new language, and most of us were never taught how to listen. The name for this process is sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass and function that accelerates after 40. But here's what matters most. Sarcopenia is not destiny. It's not an inevitable decline written into your genetic code. What it actually is a system that has changed its sensitivity to the signals you've been sending it for years. Your body hasn't stopped listening. It's simply raised the volume threshold for what constitutes a meaningful stimulus. Think about it like this. At 25, your muscles were primed to respond. Lightweight, moderate intensity, basic consistency. These were enough to trigger the cascade of signals that built muscle and maintained function. Your body was eager, responsive, almost oversensitive to stimulus. But somewhere between 40 and 50, that sensitivity changes. The same stimulus that worked before now whispers instead of shouts. Your muscles don't hear it the same way. Your mitochondria aren't being asked to do what they once did automatically. Your hormones have shifted their baseline. The entire conversation between your training and your body has changed its grammar. The question becomes, are you speaking the new language your body is asking for? Most people aren't. They keep doing what worked at 30, getting increasingly frustrated that the results have diminished. They assume they're getting older, that decline is inevitable, that this is just what happens. But the science tells a different story. The athletes and individuals who understand what's actually changing, who learn to send the right signals at the right intensity, in the right way, don't experience the same decline. They reverse it. Muscle mass recovers. Strength stabilizes. Function returns. VO2 max stops its downward trajectory and climbs again. This isn't about training harder. That's actually the opposite of what works. It's about training smarter, more specifically, with profound attention to what your body is actually asking for now that you're over 40. It's about understanding 3 powerful systems. Resistance training that speaks directly to your muscle fibers in a language they now require to respond. Steady-state cardiovascular work that rebuilds the mitochondrial foundation your endurance depends on. And movement quality that preserves the connective tissue framework that makes everything else possible. What's remarkable is that these 3 approaches address the exact molecular mechanisms that change after 40. They're not generic fitness advice. They're targeted solutions to specific biological shifts. They activate the pathways, mTOR, PGC1A, IGF-1, that directly reverse the molecular conditions of sarcopenia. They rebuild myosin heavy chains. They increase mitochondrial density. They restore the hormonal sensitivity your muscles have lost. They do what the training you've always done can no longer accomplish. In the parts that follow, we're going to walk through exactly what's happening in your body, why it's happening, and precisely how to respond. We'll explore each of these 3 training modalities in depth. We'll talk about the science in a way that actually makes sense, that connects to what you feel in your training and in your daily life. And we'll build toward a complete protocol, a way of training and living that speaks your body's new language fluently. But before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your biology is waiting for this conversation, and it's waiting right now. There's a biological explanation for what you're experiencing, and it begins with understanding how your body's response to training has fundamentally shifted. After 40, your muscles enter a state that researchers call anabolic resistance. This doesn't mean your muscles have stopped responding to training entirely. Rather, it means they've become more selective about which signals trigger growth and adaptation. The stimulus that reliably built muscle at 25 now requires greater intensity, better precision, and a more sophisticated understanding of what you're actually asking your physiology to do. The root of this shift lies in something called the leucine threshold. Leucine is an amino acid that acts as a key, unlocking the mTOR pathway, the master switch for muscle protein synthesis. At 20, your muscles required relatively little leucine to trigger this response. They were primed, eager, responsive to even modest stimulus. But after 40, that threshold rises. Your muscle fibers now demand more leucine, more mechanical tension, more cumulative stimulus before they activate the same growth response. It's as if your muscles have turned up the volume on what constitutes a meaningful signal. The whisper no longer works. You need to shout. Simultaneously, your myosin heavy chain composition is shifting. These are the thick filaments within your muscle fibers that generate force and power. At 40, you begin to preferentially lose the fast-twitch myosin isoforms, the fibers responsible for explosive strength and power generation. If you don't actively stimulate these fibers with sufficient mechanical load, they atrophy faster than slow-twitch fibers. This is why the training that maintained your physique at 30 can actually accelerate functional decline at 50. You're not sending the specific signal those fibers need to stay. Your hormonal landscape has changed as well. Testosterone production declines roughly 1% per year after 30. IGF-1, the insulin-like growth factor that mediates many anabolic responses, drops significantly. These aren't catastrophic changes, but they do matter. Your baseline capacity for muscle protein synthesis has declined. Recovery takes longer. The hormonal environment that once made building muscle relatively effortless has become more challenging. Your cortisol to testosterone ratio has shifted, which means stress management has evolved from a lifestyle preference into a physiological necessity. Elevated cortisol directly antagonizes muscle protein synthesis. Sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and poor recovery become training blockers in ways they weren't before. Your mitochondria tell a similar story. Between 40 and 60, you lose approximately 3 to 8% of mitochondrial volume per decade if you're sedentary. Even if you're active, mitochondrial density declines without specific stimulus. Your mitochondria are the powerhouses of your cells, and fewer of them means reduced aerobic capacity, slower recovery between efforts, and diminished endurance. This explains why your VO2 max has likely declined, why longer efforts feel harder, why you fatigue faster despite years of cardiovascular training. Your body has fewer cellular batteries to draw from, and the battery's efficiency has diminished. What's crucial to understand is that none of this is irreversible. This isn't biological fate. It's biological change that requires a different conversation. Your body hasn't stopped listening. It's simply demanding that you speak with greater specificity and intention. The training that works after 40 directly addresses each of these shifts. It sends signals specifically calibrated to raise the leucine threshold response. It targets the fast-twitch fibers that preferentially atrophy. It stimulates the hormonal pathways that have become more resistant. It rebuilds mitochondrial density and restores aerobic capacity. The framework that accomplishes this involves 3 distinct but interconnected systems. The first addresses mechanical tension and muscle protein synthesis directly. The second rebuilds your mitochondrial foundation and restores cardiovascular capacity. The third ensures that connective tissue, tendons, ligaments, fascia, can handle the demands you're placing on it and maintains the movement quality that prevents injury and preserves function. This is not about training harder. This is about training smarter. About understanding that your body at 45 is not a broken version of your body at 25. It's a different system with different rules, different opportunities, and a profound capacity for adaptation if you learn to speak its language. The question isn't whether change has occurred. The question is whether you're going to respond to that change with knowledge and precision, or whether you'll keep sending the old signals and wondering why they no longer work. Resistance training after 40 operates under a principle that feels counterintuitive to many people who've trained for decades. It's not about doing more, it's about doing what actually works, which often means doing less volume, but with far greater intentionality. The resistance you apply becomes a language, and at this stage of life, your muscles have become exquisitely selective about which conversations they'll engage in. The foundation of this approach rests on mechanical tension. When you place load on a muscle fiber, you create microscopic disruptions in the contractile apparatus. This damage, paradoxically, is the stimulus your body needs to rebuild that fiber stronger and larger. But here's the critical distinction. After 40, light resistance produces mainly metabolic stress without sufficient mechanical tension to trigger a robust protein synthesis response. You need genuine load, not reckless load, but load substantial enough that your muscles recognize it as a genuine demand. This is why the training that emphasized high repetitions with lightweight, which may have worked in your 30s, becomes increasingly ineffective as anabolic resistance sets in. Progressive overload changes its character. You're not necessarily adding 5 pounds to the barbell every week. Instead, you're optimizing time under tension, which means slowing the eccentric phase of the movement, the lowering portion where your muscles are being lengthened under load. You're improving movement quality and range of motion, ensuring that each repetition places maximal demand on the muscle fibers most prone to atrophy. You're tracking cumulative volume across the week rather than obsessing over individual session intensity. The goal becomes consistency in stimulus delivery, not peak performance in any single workout. The mechanotransduction cascade deserves attention here. When mechanical tension is applied to a muscle fiber, it activates stretch-sensitive ion channels on the cell membrane. These channels open, allowing calcium to flood into the cell. This calcium surge triggers a cascade of signaling events that ultimately reaches the nucleus, where it activates the genes responsible for building new muscle protein. Additionally, mechanical tension activates mTOR through a pathway called the LX signaling cascade. This is separate from the nutrient-sensing pathway that responds to amino acids. You need both conversations happening, mechanical stimulus plus adequate protein intake, for robust adaptation. Motor unit recruitment becomes paramount. A motor unit consists of a single neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. Larger motor units contain more muscle fibers, including the fast-twitch fibers that generate power and that preferentially atrophy with age. Light resistance activates primarily smaller motor units, composed mainly of slow-twitch fibers. These are the fibers you're least concerned about preserving because they're relatively resistant to aging. To recruit the larger motor units that include your power-generating fibers, you need sufficient load. This isn't arbitrary. It's neurophysiology. Your nervous system simply won't recruit large motor units to overcome light resistance. There's no reason to. Connective tissue adaptation follows a different timeline than muscle adaptation. Tendons, ligaments, and fascia are less vascularized than muscle tissue. They adapt more slowly to load. This is why ramping load too aggressively after 40 often results in tendinopathy or other connective tissue injuries. The protocol must respect this reality, adding weight gradually, maintaining movement quality throughout, and allowing adequate recovery between high-load sessions becomes non-negotiable. Rushing this process leads to injury, which sets progress back far more than patients ever could. Recovery capacity after 40 is genuinely finite. Your central nervous system fatigues faster from high-intensity resistance work. This isn't weakness, it's biology. Accumulated systemic fatigue, the sum of training stress, occupational stress, sleep debt, and emotional stress, directly limits your capacity to recover from intense resistance work. This is why prescribing high-frequency, high-intensity resistance training to 40-year-olds often backfires. The stimulus becomes excessive relative to recovery capacity. The result is plateaued or declining performance despite perceived hard work. The practical application becomes clear once you understand the science. Resistance training after 40 should involve 2 to 4 sessions per week, targeting major movement patterns. Each session should emphasize genuine load, controlled tempos, and movement quality. Volume should be tracked, but intensity should be managed relative to recovery capacity. Connective tissue demands respect through gradual progression and adequate rest days. The goal isn't building a maximal physique. It's sending a signal potent enough to preserve and build the muscle and strength that sustain function, independence, and longevity. This is the primary conversation your body is asking you to have. Zone 2 cardio has become the forgotten tool in the fitness conversation, particularly for people navigating their 40s and beyond. The emphasis in popular fitness culture has shifted almost entirely toward high-intensity interval training, toward explosive efforts that promise maximum results in minimum time. This makes intuitive sense on the surface. It feels productive, it feels urgent, but it misses something fundamental about how your cardiovascular system actually adapts and how your mitochondria respond to stimulus at this stage of your life. The science here is distinct from resistance training, though equally powerful. Where resistance training speaks directly to your muscle fibers through mechanical tension, Zone 2 cardio speaks to your mitochondria through sustained aerobic work. Your mitochondria are the cellular power plants, and they decline with age. This decline is not inevitable, but it happens unless you send the specific signal that triggers mitochondrial biogenesis. That signal is prolonged, steady-state aerobic work performed at a heart rate intensity that allows you to sustain a conversation while moving. Zone 2 sits below your aerobic threshold, the point where lactate production exceeds lactate clearance. At this intensity, you're working aerobically, meaning your muscles are generating energy with sufficient oxygen available. Your body is burning a high percentage of fat as fuel. Your heart rate remains elevated but sustainable. For most people in their 40s, this translates to roughly 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate, though the exact number depends on your fitness level and individual physiology. The practical test is simple. You should be able to speak in complete sentences without gasping, but you shouldn't be able to sing. That's the zone. What happens physiologically during Zone 2 work is where the real value emerges. Sustained aerobic stimulus activates a protein called PGC1 alpha, often called the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis. This protein signals your cells to build new mitochondria. It's not a fast process. A single Zone 2 session doesn't create immediate change, but accumulated across weeks and months, consistent Zone 2 work fundamentally shifts your mitochondrial density. You develop more power plants in your cells. More mitochondria means more ATP production, which means more available energy for everything you do, both in the gym and in daily life. This has direct implications for your VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen your cardiovascular system can deliver to your muscles. VO2 max declines with age, roughly 1% per year after age 30 if you're sedentary. With training, you can slow this decline dramatically. Zone 2 is how you do it. While high-intensity interval training can boost VO2 max acutely, it's metabolically expensive and stressful to your nervous system. Zone 2 does the work more efficiently over time, particularly as you age. The lactate threshold shifts outward with consistent Zone 2 training. Your lactate threshold is the intensity at which your body begins to accumulate lactate faster than it can clear it. Everything above that threshold becomes progressively harder to sustain. As your threshold moves higher, you're able to work at higher absolute intensities while still operating aerobically. This has profound practical implications. Tasks that felt aerobically challenging a year ago become easier. Your sustainable power output increases. Your cardiovascular endurance expands. There's also a hormonal advantage to Zone 2 that distinguishes it from higher intensity work. High-intensity exercise elevates cortisol, your primary stress hormone. Cortisol has its place, but chronically elevated cortisol works against muscle retention and recovery. Zone 2, by contrast, can be performed regularly without triggering excessive cortisol elevation. You can do Zone 2 work 5 or 6 days per week without accumulating systemic fatigue. This is why it becomes the endurance work of choice after 40. Practically, Zone 2 typically involves 30 to 90 minutes of sustained aerobic activity. This could be steady-paced running, cycling, rowing, or even brisk walking if you're building a foundation. The duration matters less than the consistency. 3 Zone 2 sessions per week represents a minimum threshold for triggering meaningful adaptation. More is often better, provided you're recovering adequately. The integration with your resistance training becomes important. Zone 2 works complement resistance training rather than compete with it. They signal different adaptive pathways. Your muscles are responding to mechanical tension from resistance work. Your mitochondria are responding to aerobic stimulus from Zone 2. Together, they create a comprehensive adaptation that addresses both the muscle preservation crisis of anabolic resistance and the cardiovascular and metabolic decline that accompanies aging. This is how you rebuild your aerobic foundation, while simultaneously preserving the muscle that makes that foundation functional. Mobility and movement quality represent the third pillar of training transformation after 40, and they operate according to principles that most people overlook entirely. While resistance training commands attention through visible load and Zone 2 cardio demands time and consistency, mobility work functions as the connective tissue conversation your body has been trying to initiate for years. This is not stretching in the casual sense. This is deliberate, systematic movement through ranges that your daily life no longer demands, positioned strategically to prevent the physical contracting and stiffening that accelerates functional decline. The biological necessity becomes apparent once you understand what happens to your connective tissue with age. Your tendons, ligaments, and fascia adapt to the demands you place on them. If those demands consistently involve a narrow range of motion repeated in predictable patterns, your connective tissue remodels to support exactly that range and nothing more. The tissues shorten, collagen cross-linking increases, your movement signature gradually contracts until simple tasks like reaching overhead or rotating your spine require effort that wasn't necessary a decade ago. This is not weakness. This is tissue specialization in the wrong direction. Range of motion and muscle fiber length are intimately connected in ways that matter enormously for your long-term function. When you train through full ranges of motion, your muscle fibers maintain their length potential. When you consistently work in restricted ranges, your sarcomeres, the contractile units of your muscle, adapt to that restriction. The fibers literally shorten their resting length. This compounds the anabolic resistance problem. Not only are your muscle fibers less responsive to growth signals after 40, but they're also adapting toward a shorter, stiffer configuration that actually reduces their functional capacity. Mobility work reverses this trajectory through positional loading and movement diversity. Controlled stretching under tension, active range of motion work, and movements that challenge your joints through their full available ranges signal your connective tissue to maintain structural integrity across the breadth of that mobility. This is joint mechanotransduction at work. Your tendons and ligaments sense mechanical stress through movement and respond by strengthening and maintaining their capacity across multiple ranges. The result is connective tissue that supports full function rather than gradually restricting it. The strategic placement of mobility within your weekly training architecture matters significantly. Mobility work should not be relegated to cool-down status. It deserves dedicated time, ideally in sessions separate from your resistance training, or positioned at times when your nervous system can attend to it properly. Many athletes find that starting the week with dedicated mobility sessions, perhaps 2 to 3 times weekly, followed by resistance training and Zone 2 work, creates an optimal sequence. Some prefer mobility work on active recovery days between harder efforts. The principle remains consistent. Movement through full ranges receives priority as a protection mechanism for your future capacity. Integrating mobility with your other training modalities requires thoughtful sequencing. Dynamic mobility preparation before resistance training activates your neuromuscular system and ensures you're able to access the ranges your workout demands. Positional breathing work, where you hold stretches while practicing deep diaphragmatic breathing, bridges mobility and autonomic nervous system activation. This isn't incidental. The parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and recovery system, becomes progressively less responsive with age unless you deliberately practice activating it. Deep breathing in extended ranges achieves multiple outcomes simultaneously. You're lengthening tissue, you're increasing joint mobility, and you're training your nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance. The prevention performance paradox resolves itself once you recognize that mobility work is performance work after 40, not its separate category. The positions you maintain now are the ranges you'll be able to access in your 60s and 70s. The shoulder mobility you preserve through deliberate work is the same shoulder capacity you'll draw on when reaching, throwing, or lifting overhead years from now. The hip mobility you maintain is the foundation for walking quality, stair navigation, and lower body resilience. Every angle of movement you protect is a physical future you're securing. The consistency required mirrors your resistance training commitment. Effective mobility work demands regular practice, ideally daily in some form, with dedicated sessions 2 to 3 times weekly, where you're systematically addressing ranges relevant to your movement patterns and limitations. This creates redundancy that ensures you're building tissue adaptations rather than addressing symptom management through isolated stretching sessions. Your connective tissue responds to consistent signal, just as your muscles and mitochondria do. The stimulus must be regular, progressive, and positioned within a coherent framework rather than scattered through your week as afterthoughts. The integration protocol is where resistance training, zone 2 cardio, and mobility work converge into a single coherent system that speaks to your aging biology in its own language. This is not 3 separate programs layered on top of each other. This is a unified architecture where each component amplifies the others, where the stimulus from one training modality creates the conditions for the others to work more effectively. Understanding how to structure this weekly conversation with your body determines whether you experience transformation or merely going through the motions. The weekly architecture begins with a principle that feels counterintuitive to many people who spent decades pursuing more volume and higher intensity. After 40, your recovery capacity is finite. Your hormonal profile, your sleep quality, your ability to clear metabolic stress, all of these become the limiting factors rather than your willingness to suffer through another set. The strategic question shifts from how much can I do to what is the minimum effective dose that creates maximum adaptation while preserving recovery capacity for the next stimulus. A practical weekly framework might look like this: 2 dedicated resistance training sessions spaced 3 to 4 days apart, 2 to 3 zone 2 cardio sessions ranging from 30 to 60 minutes depending on your baseline aerobic fitness, and 2 to 3 dedicated mobility sessions that are completely separate from your harder training days. This creates what's called a stimulus distribution pattern, where your nervous system receives different signals on different days, allowing adaptation without chronic fatigue accumulation. Monday might be a resistance session targeting lower body. Wednesday could be a zone 2 session. Thursday brings mobility work. Saturday arrives with upper body resistance training. Sunday features another zone 2 session. Tuesday and Friday become active recovery days with light movement or additional mobility work if desired. The signaling hierarchy within this framework matters enormously. When your energy and recovery resources are limited, which they invariably are after 40, you must prioritize the stimuli that address your most critical adaptations. Resistance training gets prioritized because it's the most potent trigger for maintaining muscle protein synthesis and addressing anabolic resistance. Zone 2, cardio receives second priority because it's the primary stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis and cardiovascular resilience. Mobility work, while critical for long-term function, can be adapted based on your current recovery status without completely derailing your progress. This doesn't mean mobility becomes optional. It means that on weeks when recovery is genuinely compromised, you maintain your resistance training and zone 2 work while potentially condensing your mobility sessions into shorter, focused intervals. Cumulative dose tracking becomes more important than individual session intensity once you understand how your body actually adapts. Your muscles don't care whether you accumulated 20 sets through 2 heavy sessions or through 4 moderate sessions. Your mitochondria don't distinguish between one long zone 2 session or 2 shorter ones totaling the same duration. What matters is the total stimulus over time combined with adequate recovery. Many athletes find that tracking weekly volume metrics, total sets per muscle group, total zone 2 minutes, total dedicated mobility time, provides better feedback than obsessing over single-session performance metrics. This shift in measurement changes behavior in profound ways. You stop asking whether today's workout was hard enough and start asking whether this week's cumulative stimulus is appropriate for your recovery status. Periodization after 40 operates differently than the linear progression model many people learned in their 20s. Your body benefits from building blocks of 4 to 8 week cycles, where you gradually increase stimulus, then intentionally back off for a recovery week. During the increasing phase, you might progress your resistance training through small load increases while maintaining zone 2 consistency. Your mobility work deepens, exploring slightly more challenging ranges. Then comes a deload week where you reduce volume by approximately 20 to 30%, allowing your nervous system and connective tissue to catch up to the stimulus. This creates an adaptation pattern where growth happens during the recovery weeks, following the stimulus block rather than during the hard training itself. Sleep, nutrition, and hormonal recovery form the infrastructure that allows this entire protocol to function. Without adequate sleep, ideally 7 to 9 hours nightly, your nervous system cannot fully recover between sessions. Your growth hormone release becomes compromised, and your ability to build new mitochondria through Zone 2 training diminishes significantly. Protein intake becomes more critical after 40 because your muscles require higher absolute protein amounts to trigger the same protein synthesis response. Carbohydrate availability around your resistance training sessions supports force production and recovery. The hormonal conversation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within the context of sleep quality, nutritional sufficiency, and stress management. Individual variation means that this framework serves as a starting template, not a prescription. Some people recover faster and can handle slightly higher frequency. Others thrive with lower frequency but higher intensity. Your job is to read your own recovery signals, resting heart rate, sleep quality, morning readiness, joint comfort, training performance, and adjust responsively. This is where training becomes truly personalized. You're learning your own biology's particular language, adjusting the vocabulary until communication becomes fluent. The future of your function begins the moment you commit to speaking your body's language fluently. This is not a distant promise or a theoretical possibility. This is a biological inevitability that emerges when stimulus meets consistency, meets time. The research consistently demonstrates what happens when people over 40 send the right signals with appropriate frequency. Muscle fiber, cross-sectional area increases, reversing years of sarcopenic decline. Mitochondrial density rises measurably, often returning to levels comparable to younger individuals who train sporadically. VO2 max improvements that seemed impossible at your age become routine achievements. You experience the cognitive clarification that comes from restored cardiovascular capacity and improved oxygen delivery to your brain. The brain fog lifts not because of supplements or protocols, but because your biology has been given permission to function optimally again. Sarcopenia is not destiny. This is perhaps the most liberating insight available to anyone navigating their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. The biological aging process is real, but it exists on a spectrum that responds dramatically to stimulus. Chronological age and biological age have become increasingly decoupled in research examining people who train intentionally. A person of 55 who sends consistent resistance and cardiorespiratory signals through proper training can possess the mitochondrial density and muscle protein synthesis capacity of someone chronologically 15 years younger. A person of 65 who has trained consistently for 5 years can demonstrate strength, mobility, and aerobic capacity that far exceeds sedentary individuals who are chronologically 30 years their junior. The narrative of inevitable decline has become the story you tell yourself when you don't know how to speak your body's new language. Once you learn it, that narrative becomes optional. This transformation reaches far beyond what you'll observe in the mirror or feel in the gym. The functional benefits penetrate into every dimension of daily life. The independence to carry your own groceries without assistance. The capacity to play with children or grandchildren without pain limiting your engagement. The ability to travel without your body becoming the limiting constraint on your experience. The confidence that your knees, hips, and shoulders will support the activities you choose rather than the activities your body permits. The cognitive sharpness that emerges when your cardiovascular system delivers oxygen efficiently to your brain. The resilience that comes from knowing your body can adapt and improve rather than merely decline. These are not trivial benefits. These are the foundations of quality of life and autonomous function across decades. This matters beyond the gym, because the gym is where you build the capacity for life outside the gym. Your training is not separate from your existence. It is infrastructure for your existence. Every set of resistance training strengthens the foundation that allows you to move through the world with strength and stability. Every Zone 2 session builds the cardiovascular resilience that sustains your energy through full days and full weeks. Every mobility session preserves the movement options that let you live without restriction. When you understand training this way, the commitment stops feeling optional or vain. It becomes a conversation with your future self, building the biological resources that future version will desperately appreciate. Your next step requires specificity and commitment. This is not a program you sample or modify based on the latest algorithm. This is a protocol you implement with consistency, tracking your weekly volume, monitoring your recovery signals, and allowing periodization blocks to create adaptation. You select 2 resistance sessions spaced adequately for recovery. You commit to 2 to 3 Zone 2 sessions that fit your schedule and aerobic baseline. You integrate mobility work on days separate from your harder efforts. You sleep like your life depends on it, because your life does depend on it. You consume adequate protein and carbohydrates. You accept that this will require time, and that time is the most honest measure of commitment. Biological age and chronological age are no longer the same thing. One is a number that increases regardless of your actions. The other is a conversation you have with your body through training, nutrition, sleep, and consistency. Your body is not aging in a linear, predetermined direction. Your body is waiting for you to speak its language fluently, to send it signals that matter, to provide it with the stimulus it requires to maintain and rebuild what years of inactivity allowed to diminish. You now know what language to speak. You now understand the vocabulary. The translation happens through action, through weeks and months of consistency, through the integration of resistance and cardiorespiratory training and mobility work into a unified protocol that speaks directly to your aging biology. The future of your function is not something that happens to you. It is something you build, beginning today.